The photograph surfaced during the 2023 digitization project at the Willow Creek Historical Society in northern Montana. Housed in a weathered leather album donated by the Morrison family estate, the large silver gelatin print captured a wedding party posed on the steps of St. Matthew's Church on June 14, 1913. Labeled simply Clayton Morrison Wedding, 1913, the image showed a prosperous-looking gathering of approximately 30 individuals arranged in formal rows, with the bride and groom centered on the church steps. Museum curator Dr. Abigail Harmon initially cataloged the photograph as one of dozens of similar early 20th century wedding portraits in the collection. The Morrison family had been prominent ranchers in the region, and Charles Morrison's marriage to Elizabeth Clayton represented a union of two influential local families whose descendants still lived in the area. It wasn't until Dr. Harmon began the high-resolution digitization process that she noticed something unusual about the image. While the adult members of the wedding party displayed the formal, composed expressions typical of early 20th century photography, a small figure in the front row stood out dramatically from the rest. The flower girl, a child of perhaps 6 or 7 years old, stared directly at the camera with an expression of unmistakable terror, her eyes wide, mouth partially open, and small hands clutching her flower basket with white-knuckled intensity. The child's expression is genuinely disturbing, Dr. Harmon noted in her initial catalog entry. While everyone else in the photograph maintains the composed, somewhat stern countenance typical of formal photography from this period, this little girl appears genuinely frightened. The contrast is striking enough to transform the entire mood of the image when you notice her. Even more intriguing was a small notation on the back of the photograph in faded ink. Complete wedding party including Margaret Clayton. The deliberate inclusion of this specific child's name, when none of the other attendants were individually identified, suggested something significant about her presence that warranted documentation. This curious detail prompted Dr. Harmon to launch an investigation into the Clayton Morrison wedding and the identity of the visibly distressed flower girl who stood out so dramatically in an otherwise conventional wedding portrait. Dr. Harmon began her investigation by examining official records concerning the Clayton and Morrison families in early 20th century Willow Creek. Marriage records confirmed that Charles Morrison, 28, and Elizabeth Clayton, 22, were wed at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church on June 14, 1913, with Reverend Thomas Blackwood officiating. The marriage license listed the bride's parents as George and Catherine Clayton, prominent members of the community who owned the local bank and several commercial properties. Birth records revealed that Margaret Clayton was born on September 3, 1906, making her nearly 7 years old at the time of the wedding. She was identified as the younger sister of the bride, Elizabeth Clayton, with a 12-year age gap between the siblings. The significant age difference suggested Margaret might have been an unexpected late addition to the Clayton family. Parish records from St. Matthew's Church showed regular attendance by the Clayton family, including young Margaret, though a notation from early 1913 indicated she had been excused from Sunday services for a period of recovery, without specifying the nature of any illness or condition. School enrollment records showed Margaret had not yet begun formal education at the time of the wedding, despite being of typical school age, another subtle anomaly. The documentary evidence presents several small inconsistencies regarding Margaret Clayton, Dr. Harmon explained to her research assistant. While nothing indicates severe problems, these minor discrepancies suggest circumstances that deviated somewhat from the typical patterns for a child of her age and social standing. Most intriguing was a notation in the church's wedding register, where the officiating minister typically recorded basic details of the ceremony. In addition to standard information about the couple and witnesses, Reverend Blackwood had written, "Special arrangements made for younger Clayton child as requested by family. Ceremony briefly delayed due to minor incident during procession." This cryptic note, combined with Margaret's startled expression in the photograph, suggested that something unusual had occurred during the wedding ceremony, something significant, enough to be noted in official records but not explained in detail. Dr. Harmon turned to local newspaper archives to gather more information about the Clayton Morrison wedding. As the union of two prominent families, the event had received considerable coverage in the Willow Creek Gazette, the region's primary newspaper. The June 16, 1913 edition featured a detailed account of the wedding on its society page. The article described the ceremony as one of the most lavish social events of the season, noting the church's decoration with white roses and lilies creating an atmosphere of serene elegance. It listed prominent guests, detailed the bride's satin gown with Belgian lace, and described the 5-course dinner that followed at the Clayton family home. A paragraph midway through the article provided the first clue about Margaret's situation. The bridal procession included Miss Catherine Morrison as maid of honor, with Mrs. Eleanor Thornton and Grace Sullivan as bridesmaids. Miss Margaret Clayton, younger sister of the bride, served as flower girl, overcoming her well-known timidity to perform her role admirably despite a momentary hesitation before entering the sanctuary. A separate, smaller article in the same newspaper from April 1913, 2 months before the wedding, offered additional context. It reported on a fire at the Clayton residence that had apparently been contained quickly with minimal damage. The small blaze, which began in an upstairs bedroom, was swiftly extinguished by quick-thinking household staff before the fire brigade arrived. All family members escaped without injury, though young Margaret Clayton was treated for mild smoke inhalation and shock. Dr. Wilson reports the child is recovering well but may experience heightened nervousness for some time. Most revealing was a brief society note from May 1913. Mrs. Catherine Clayton reports that preparations for her daughter Elizabeth's June wedding proceed apace. The event will include young Margaret as flower girl, a responsibility the child approaches with mixed emotions following her recent fright. Mrs. Clayton has engaged Miss Sarah Hopkins, formerly of Boston Children's Hospital, to provide special preparation and accompaniment for Margaret during the ceremony. These newspaper accounts suggested that Margaret had experienced a traumatic event, likely the house fire, approximately 2 months before the wedding, resulting in ongoing anxiety that required special arrangements for her participation in her sister's ceremony. To better understand Margaret Clayton's apparent distress in the wedding photograph, Dr. Harmon consulted with Dr. Rebecca Foster, a child psychologist specializing in historical trauma responses at the University of Montana. Using the high-resolution digital scan of the photograph and the contextual information gathered thus far, Dr. Foster conducted a detailed analysis of Margaret's visible emotional state. The child in this photograph displays classic physical indicators of acute anxiety or fear, Dr. Foster confirmed after careful examination. Her facial expression shows widened eyes with visible sclera, white, all around the iris, raised eyebrows, and a partially open mouth, all physiological manifestations of the fight-or-flight response. Her posture is rigid and her hands grip the flower basket with excessive force, another indication of extreme tension. Dr. Foster explained that Margaret's expression differed significantly from the typical solemnity seen in early 20th century photography. While people often didn't smile in formal photographs of this era, there's a clear difference between composed seriousness and active distress. The adults and other children show the expected formal composure, while Margaret displays genuine alarm. The psychologist noted that the newspaper accounts of a fire 2 months prior provided crucial context. Based on the historical information, this child likely experienced a significant traumatic event during the house fire. In modern terms, she appears to be displaying symptoms consistent with what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. The formal wedding environment, possibly including candles or other fire elements that would have been standard in a 1913 ceremony, may have triggered a fear response related to her recent trauma. Dr. Foster also commented on the historical treatment of childhood trauma. In 1913, understanding of psychological trauma was in its infancy. Sigmund Freud had published some early work on trauma, but these ideas had hardly reached mainstream medical practice in rural Montana. The family's engagement of a nurse with hospital experience suggests they recognized Margaret needed special support, but they would have had limited framework for understanding her psychological needs beyond basic nervousness or shock. Most significantly, Dr. Foster observed that Margaret's inclusion in the wedding, despite her obvious distress, reflected early 20th century attitudes toward children's emotional experiences. Today, we might excuse a child from such a public role if they were experiencing this level of anxiety. In 1913, The priority would have been fulfilling family obligations and maintaining social appearances, with children expected to perform their duties regardless of their emotional state. Dr. Harmon's research led her to a collection of Clayton family correspondence preserved in the Montana Historical Society archives. Among these materials were letters between Catherine Clayton and her sister Rebecca in Minneapolis, spanning 1910 to 1920. These personal communications provided intimate insights into the family's experience before and after the wedding. In a letter dated April 22, 1913, shortly after the house fire, Catherine wrote, "We have had a dreadful fright at home, though thankfully all are safe now. A lamp overturned in Margaret's bedroom while her nurse was momentarily absent, causing a fire that spread quickly to the curtains and bedding. The child awoke to flames and smoke, and her screams alerted the household. By the time George reached her, the room was thick with smoke, though the flames had not yet spread beyond her furnishings. Margaret was physically unharmed save for some coughing from the smoke, but the experience has affected her terribly. She refuses to sleep alone and becomes hysterical at the sight of even a candle or matchstick. Dr. Wilson has prescribed a mild sedative for her worst episodes and suggests time will eventually diminish these fears." A subsequent letter from May 30, 1913, 2 weeks before the wedding, revealed growing concerns about Margaret's role in the ceremony. Elizabeth insists that her sister participate as planned, saying a family wedding must include all family members in their proper roles. "I have my doubts about Margaret's readiness for such public scrutiny, as her nerves remain fragile. The child becomes paralyzed with fear at the mention of the church candles, though she desperately wishes to please her sister. We have engaged a nurse with experience in nervous disorders to work with Margaret daily in preparation, gradually introducing her to the church environment and the sight of controlled flames. There has been progress, though I worry it insufficient for the demands of the ceremony." Most revealing was Catherine's letter written 3 days after the wedding. "The day proceeded largely as planned, despite our concerns about Margaret. The child managed remarkably well through the preparations and procession practices, but became terrified upon entering the church with its many candles. She froze entirely at the sanctuary entrance, unable to move forward or back, her small face a mask of pure terror. The nurse, Miss Hopkins, quickly took her hand and whispered something that enabled Margaret to continue, though the fear never left her eyes. Elizabeth was understandably distressed by the delay but recovered her composure admirably. The photographer captured the wedding party immediately following the ceremony, and though all attempted to present a proper appearance, poor Margaret's fright remained evident. George suggests we might commission a retouched version for public display, though I find I cannot bring myself to erase this honest record of the day, difficult as it may be. These private communications confirmed that Margaret had experienced a traumatic fire in her bedroom approximately 2 months before the wedding, resulting in significant psychological distress that remained evident during the ceremony despite the family's careful preparations. A remarkable discovery came when Dr. Harmon located the professional papers of Sarah Hopkins, the nurse mentioned in the Clayton family letters, in the archives of the Montana Nursing Historical Association. Hopkins had been a nurse at Boston Children's Hospital before relocating to Montana in 1910, bringing with her progressive ideas about children's psychological care developed during her East Coast training. Hopkins' case notes, maintained for ENOS, her private reference rather than as official medical records, included several pages dedicated to MC female, age 6, from May-June 1913. These notes offered a professional perspective on Margaret's condition and the approaches used to prepare her for the wedding. An entry from May 12, 1913, outlined the situation. Called to Clayton home regarding younger daughter, M, age 6, suffering from nervous condition following bedroom fire in April. Child exhibits extreme fear response to fire in any form, including candles, matches, and even fireplace. Physical symptoms include rapid breathing, pallor, perspiration, and occasional mutism when confronted with fear trigger. Parents primarily concerned with child's ability to participate in upcoming wedding ceremony, which will require her presence in candlelit church. Mother shows genuine concern for child's distress. Father more focused on social appearances and family obligations. Hopkins documented her therapeutic approach, implementing gradual exposure technique as learned from Dr. Morton at Children's. Begin with discussions of fire safety, emphasizing control and prevention. Progress to brief exposure to single candle at increasing proximity, teaching breathing techniques to manage fear response. Final stage will include accompanied visits to church to practice procession amid unlit, then lit candles. Child's cooperation remarkable despite evident terror. Strong desire to please family provides motivation despite physiological fear response. Note from June 10th, just 4 days before the wedding, expressed concern. Rehearsal today demonstrated limited progress. M proceeded through empty church adequately, but became immobile upon entering fully prepared sanctuary with all candles lit. Required physical guidance and continuous verbal reassurance to complete practice procession. Recommended to family that child's participation be reconsidered, but met with resistance, particularly from father and elder sister. Compromise reached. I will walk immediately behind M during ceremony to intervene if necessary. Have prepared small lavender sachet for M to hold within flower basket, providing calming scent as distraction from fear triggers. Hopkins's final entry, dated June 15, 1913, reflected on the wedding itself. Ceremony proceeded despite M's evident distress. Child required physical guidance to enter sanctuary, but completed assigned role while maintaining minimum composure. Visible trembling and facial expression revealed fear level despite preparation, yet no outward behavioral disruption occurred. Family expressed satisfaction with outcome, defining success as absence of obvious incident rather than child's emotional experience. Photography session immediately following ceremony captured M's continued distress before I could intervene to remove her for recovery period. Have recommended continued therapeutic work addressing fire response, though family interest may diminish now that social obligation completed. This case illustrates prevailing attitude toward children's emotional needs, secondary to social requirements and adult convenience. These professional observations provided crucial context for Margaret's expression in the photograph, documenting both the therapeutic approaches available in 1913 and the limitations imposed by social expectations of the era. Dr. Harmon identified the photographer of the Clayton Morrison wedding as William Hayes, who operated Hayes Photography Studio in Willow Creek from 1902 to 1936. Hayes had been the primary documentary photographer for the region's social events, and his business records were preserved in the Montana State University Special Collections. Hayes's appointment book confirmed the Clayton Morrison Wedding Commission on June 14, 1913, with a notation indicating a premium package, including multiple large prints, several dozen cabinet cards for distribution, and exclusive rights to document the entire event from preparation through reception. Most valuably, Hayes had maintained a technical journal where he recorded specific challenges and solutions for significant commissions. His entry regarding the Clayton Morrison wedding provided direct insights into the creation of the photograph in question. Clayton Morrison wedding, largest commission of the season, required full equipment transport to church location. Lighting. Challenges significant due to mixed conditions. Bright June sunlight on church steps created extreme contrast with subject's attire. Employed reflector screens to moderate light balance and prevent shadowing on bride's gown. Wedding party arrangement typical save for special instruction regarding younger Clayton child. Mother requested specific positioning allowing nurse to stand directly behind child, though not visible in final composition. Delay in ceremony due to child's distress resulted in shifted schedule, reducing optimal light conditions for exterior portraiture. Multiple exposures taken of complete wedding party. Standard exposure time required extraordinary stillness from all subjects, particularly difficult for youngest participant, who exhibited visible distress throughout. Final selected negative represents best technical quality despite flower girl's expression. Alternative exposures showed motion blur from child's trembling. Family representative, father, reviewed proofs and selected this version despite child's countenance, stating historical accuracy must sometimes prevail over perfect presentation. Note for future society weddings, when young children are involved, in bridal party, recommends separate groupings with shorter exposure requirements to accommodate limited stillness capacity. Hayes' granddaughter, still living in Willow Creek, provided additional context during an interview. "My grandfather mentioned the Clayton Morrison wedding several times over the years. It was a prestigious commission, but technically challenging. He said the little flower girl was terrified throughout the event, something about a fire she'd been in recently. Grandfather typically took multiple exposures, hoping to capture at least one with everyone looking appropriate, but apparently, this child never relaxed enough to present the expected expression. He was surprised when Mr. Clayton selected the most technically perfect negative, rather than one that might have partially obscured the child's fear, as most families would have prioritized presenting an idealized image over technical quality. These professional observations confirmed that Margaret's expression in the photograph represented her actual emotional state during the wedding, preserved through a combination of technical necessity and the family patriarch's unexpected preference for documentary accuracy. To understand the Clayton family's decisions regarding Margaret's participation in the wedding despite her obvious distress, Dr. Harmon consulted with Dr. James Henderson, a historian specializing in early 20th century American social customs at Montana State University. Together, they analyzed how the photograph reflected the expectations and practices regarding children in formal social events of the era. The period between 1900 and 1920 represented a transitional time in American attitudes toward children, Dr. Henderson explained. Earlier Victorian views of children as little adults expected to conform to rigid social requirements were gradually giving way to more progressive attitudes influenced by emerging child development theories. However, this transition occurred unevenly across regions and social classes, with traditional expectations often persisting longer in rural areas and among established families concerned with maintaining social propriety. Research into wedding customs of the period revealed that children's participation as flower girls and ring bearers was standard practice in middle and upper-class ceremonies, regardless of the children's comfort or inclination. Family obligation typically outweighed individual preference or emotional state, particularly for significant social events that functioned as public displays of family status and continuity. What makes this photograph particularly interesting, Dr. Henderson noted, is that it captures a moment when multiple cultural forces were in tension. The traditional expectation that a child would perform assigned social duties regardless of personal distress clearly prevailed in requiring Margaret's participation. Yet the emerging awareness of children's psychological needs is evident in the family's engagement of a specially trained nurse to prepare Margaret and support her through the ceremony. The historical context also explained the decision to preserve and display the photograph, despite Margaret's obvious distress. Early 20th century photography served both documentary and aspirational purposes, Dr. Henderson explained. While families often sought idealized representations, the photographic record also functioned as historical documentation, particularly for significant events in prominent families. George Clayton's decision to select the technically superior image despite his daughter's frightened expression suggests a commitment to historical accuracy that somewhat contradicts the period's typical preference for idealized family presentation. Research into similar cases from the period revealed that children's emotional experiences were rarely prioritized in public family events. Newspaper accounts and family records from comparable Montana weddings in the 1910s showed numerous instances where children were expected to perform ceremonial roles despite illness, fatigue, or distress, with social obligation consistently outweighing consideration of the child's emotional state. This photograph captures a moment when the child's actual experience breaks through the carefully constructed social facade, Dr. Henderson concluded. While everything else in the image conforms to the expected presentation of an ideal early 20th century wedding, Margaret's expression reveals the emotional reality that such social expectations often concealed, the personal cost of maintaining proper appearances. Dr. Harmon's investigation into what happened to Margaret Clayton after the wedding revealed how the traumatic experiences of her childhood influenced her subsequent life. Census records, school registrations, newspaper accounts, and family correspondence together created a portrait of a life shaped by early experiences. By the 1920 census, Margaret was listed as a student at St. Mary's Boarding School for Girls in Helena, Montana, approximately 100 miles from her family home in Willow Creek. School records indicated she entered the institution in September 1914, shortly after her 8th birthday and approximately a year after the wedding photograph was taken. While boarding school education was not uncommon for wealthy families, the decision to send such a young child away from home suggested possible continuing difficulties following her traumatic experiences. Letters between Catherine Clayton and the school headmistress, preserved in the St. Mary's archives, offered some insights. In August 1914, Catherine wrote, "Margaret continues to struggle with nervousness and sleep disturbances despite our best efforts at home. Dr. Wilson suggests that a structured environment away from the site of her frightening experience might allow her to progress beyond these difficulties. While our hearts break at the thought of sending her away so young, we believe St. Mary's combination of excellent education and compassionate supervision offers the best hope for her recovery and development." School progress reports indicated that Margaret initially had difficulty adjusting, but gradually showed improvement. A teacher's note from December 1914 observed, "Miss Clayton becomes noticeably anxious when candles are lit for evening prayers or special occasions. We have arranged for her to sit near the exit during such times and have exempted her from certain evening ceremonies. Her academic performance is excellent when her nervousness is accommodated." By 1916, Margaret's school reports showed significant improvement, with the headmistress noting, "Miss Clayton has made remarkable progress in managing her specific anxieties. While she maintains a serious demeanor compared to her peers, she now participates in all school activities, including candlelit ceremonies, with only minimal visible distress. Her academic achievements are exemplary, particularly in sciences and mathematics." Newspaper accounts and family correspondence tracked Margaret's subsequent development. Unlike her sister Elizabeth, who followed the expected path of marriage and family life, Margaret pursued higher education, unusual for women of her era and social background. The Willow Creek Gazette reported in June 1924 that Miss Margaret Clayton, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. George Clayton, has graduated with honors from Smith College with a degree in chemistry, one of few women in this demanding scientific field. Further research revealed that Margaret went on to earn a master's degree in chemistry from the University of Chicago in 1926. Professional records showed she subsequently worked as a research chemist for a pharmaceutical company in Chicago, contributing to the development of several medications, including early sedatives and anxiety treatments. Most poignantly, an interview with Margaret Clayton published in a 1952 scientific journal, when she was recognized for her contributions to pharmacology, made a subtle reference to her early experiences. "My interest in medications that address nervous conditions stems from personal experience with fear and its physical manifestations. Science has the power to transform terrifying experiences into understanding that benefits others facing similar challenges." This trajectory suggested that Margaret's traumatic childhood experiences and their treatment ultimately influenced her professional path, directing her toward scientific work that addressed the very types of anxiety she had experienced as the frightened flower girl captured in the 1913 wedding photograph. Through extensive research across multiple archives, Dr. Harmon gradually pieced together the complete story behind the Clayton Morrison wedding photograph and its enduring significance as a historical document. The final chapter of this investigation explored how the image had been viewed and preserved by subsequent generations. George and Catherine Clayton had displayed the large wedding portrait in their formal parlor despite Margaret's frightened expression, according to inventories of their home conducted after George's death in 1928. Catherine's will, executed after her death in 1935, specifically bequeathed the photograph to Margaret rather than to Elizabeth the bride, with a notation that this image belongs rightfully to Margaret, whose courage it documents. Interviews with elderly residents of Willow Creek who remembered the Clayton family revealed that the photograph had been a conversation piece in the community. Harriet Johnson, age 97, recalled, "People would sometimes ask about the little girl who looked so scared in the Clayton wedding picture. Mrs. Clayton would simply say that Margaret had been through a frightening experience before the wedding, but had persevered despite her fears. She seemed proud of her younger daughter's fortitude rather than embarrassed by her visible distress." Margaret Clayton never married and had no children, spending most of her adult life in Chicago while maintaining her family connections in Montana. After her death in 1968, her personal effects were returned to Willow Creek, including the wedding photograph. Her will included specific instructions that the image should eventually be donated to a historical institution as an honest record of childhood experience in an era when children's feelings were seldom considered worthy of accommodation or documentation. Dr. Margaret Wilson, a psychology professor at the University of Montana who specializes in childhood trauma, offered perspective on the photograph's significance. This image provides rare visual documentation of childhood emotional experience, in an era when such experiences were typically suppressed rather than acknowledged. The fact that the photograph was preserved and passed down rather than destroyed or retouched tells us something important about how this particular family came to value authenticity over social appearance, a surprisingly modern perspective for the early 20th century. When Dr. Harmon's research was complete, the Willow Creek Historical Society featured the wedding photograph in a special exhibition titled Visible Emotions: Children's Experiences in Historical Photography. The exhibition contextualized the image alongside information about early 20th century attitudes toward childhood, emerging understanding of psychological trauma, and Margaret Clayton's subsequent scientific career developing treatments for anxiety, fulfilling her own bequest that the photograph serve as an educational resource. In the exhibition's guest book, a descendant of Elizabeth Clayton Morrison wrote, "Our family has always known this photograph as the one with Aunt Margaret looking scared. We never knew the full story behind her expression until now. How remarkable that her frightening experience as a child eventually led to her life's work helping others manage fear. Thank you for preserving not just our family's image but the human story behind it." The photograph, capturing a fleeting moment of genuine emotion amid the carefully composed social performance of an early 20th century wedding, had transformed from family portrait to historical document, preserving the reality of one child's experience for future generations to recognize and understand.